right. General, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining the week. So the first question is Russia, as we know, is probably getting ready for a new offensive in the coming weeks. What do you expect from this new offensive? Your feelings about it? What do you think about the ISW's predictions that this offensive will run out of steam by April? And what do you think about Rammstein coming up in the context of these, fears of the new Russian offensive?
Well, first of all, I am skeptical of the estimates about the size of this mobilization, the size of any coming offensive. I don't believe any numbers that come out of Moscow to begin with. I doubt that they have fixed all the problems that we saw with the last mobilization back in September, that the logistics system is not prepared. Even if they could find 200,000 or 300,000 new people, I don't know that their logistics are in place. Of course, they're not interested in creating a modern lethal force, only mass. But still, to have effect from this, for any sort of invasion with mass, you still need transportation, you still need ammunition, you still need the capability to support even untrained massed infantry. So I am a little bit skeptical that there is going to be some significant new sort of thing. For sure, they want Ukraine, they want all of us worrying about a new offensive, looking to the northern border, worrying about a new threat so that Ukraine is not able to focus its efforts where it wants to. But I think that the combined intelligence capabilities of Ukraine, the US, and the UK will have a good feel for what really is out there. No doubt they will push lots of untrained infantry into the meat grinder as they have been doing in hopes of overwhelming Ukraine's defenses.
General, my Special Forces Brigade was and still is on many front lines, and now my comrades are fighting Russians near Bakhmut and Soledar. This is probably the hottest spot on the front line so far. But we saw Russians struggling mostly with their infantry units, which were not willing to attack, and only mercenaries like Wagner Group or Russian paratroopers were able to conduct any sort of attacks. For any sort of big offensive, especially if we're talking offensive on different fronts, probably in Zaporizhia and Kharkiv region or elsewhere in Kiev, probably, Russians would definitely need more enhanced and trained infantry battalions. Do you think that since the start of so-called partial mobilization, Russian general staff managed to train enough troops for that sort of offensive?
General, do you hear us? Так, Тарас, он завис. Сейчас, секунду.
Завис.
Да. Ты, главное, не выходить, это и не закрывать. Это StreamYard я использую. Сейчас. Что ж такое? General. Не. Let's see, дай ему напишу. Ага. Так. Let's see.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. I'm just trying to go. We have you here. Let's see, Ben from studio. Okay, there we go. Let's continue.
Yeah, General, did you hear my question, sir?
It was breaking up. I could not
okay.
hear it.
I will repeat it once again. Yes, sir. So, General, my Special Forces Brigade was fighting against Russians on many front lines, and now near Bakhmut, probably the hottest spot on a front line. We saw Russian General Command struggling with forcing their forces to go into fight, and we saw only mercenaries from Wagner Group and the elite paratroopers who were able to conduct any sort of attacks. From your perspective, General, do you think that Russian General Staff managed to train and equipped enough Russian forces, so-called after beginning of so-called partial mobilization, to conduct a big offensive, like it was said by many experts?
Well, of course, Taras, I would defer to your expertise because you've been there. You know what you have seen. But in my professional assessment, I don't see how they will have repaired the institutional problems they have logistically. They don't have, as far as I can tell, even the cadre of experienced sergeants and officers to train new soldiers, basic things. And of course, as you know, having a lot of soldiers does not equal having a good unit or a good capability. So I would anticipate in whatever happens over the next 2 or 3 months that they will continue to rely on untrained mass numbers and to try to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders. I think that the Wagner Group today is nothing like what it was a year ago. That they too have suffered lots of casualties, to include amongst their more experienced, better fighters. So even the airborne units have lost so many of their experienced soldiers, and so they've had to fill up with replacements from recently mobilized soldiers, is what I believe. You may have a better view of this. So I think that they've got all of us talking about, huge mobilization, huge offensive, to cause us to worry, to be distracted about something that I don't believe they can do, at least not to the level that is being discussed.
General, the question regarding F-16s, having given Ukraine tanks, essentially promised to give Ukraine tanks, what's keeping the allies from making the next steps? Is it any qualitatively different? And is giving Ukraine F-16s a political question, a military, or a logistic one?
So I think we have a very weak connection. I could only hear parts of that. What I think I heard you ask was about F-16s.
Yes.
So, okay. So I personally prefer to avoid talking about specific weapons or specific platforms, but instead focus on what is the capability that is required for Ukraine. And it seems to me that the capability that is required for Ukraine is the ability to strike long range with precision, whether that comes from an F-16 or a TACMS or drone like a Gray Eagle, whatever the system is. What's most important is the capability to hit long range with precision. And as General Cavoli, the SACEUR, has said, precision can defeat mass as long as you have enough time. And there are some vulnerabilities underneath the Russian reliance on mass infantry and mass artillery. If you can destroy the headquarters and if you can destroy the transportation network, then you can undermine or degrade the effectiveness of the mass infantry and the mass artillery. So if that's true, and I certainly believe it is, then the capabilities that are needed are for precision long-range weapons, regardless of the platform. F-16s, of course, I'm 100% in favor of F-16s being delivered, but that's not the debate. That should not be the debate. The debate should be focused on what is the capability? And then there are different systems that can provide that capability. But when you get wrapped up into a debate about F-16s, then it turns into, well, how long will it take? How much training, the maintenance, just like this waste of time we had on M1 tanks. Instead, talk about capability that will enable Ukraine to achieve a decisive victory over the Russians this year that would result in the liberation of Crimea. That's what matters. Donbass will follow. When you liberate Crimea, which I think is possible by the end of this summer, if you get the long range capability I'm talking about, then everything else will follow after that. Crimea is the key.
General, on the beginning of this full-scale invasion, many military experts said that Russian military machine could crack after that the number of casualties would be more than 10,000. Now we see, well, according to Ukrainian general staff, that the general number of Russian military casualties is more than 120,000, and still the Russians are fighting. They still follow the orders of their officers. From your perspective, in terms of contemporary Russian armed forces, what can break the backbone of Russian army and the backbone of Russian general staff? Is it number of casualties, well, series of military defeats, or something else?
So I don't know who said that Russia would crack after 10,000 casualties. That makes no sense. And I would never use numbers of casualties as the decisive metric for whether or not they would continue. We know from history that war is a test of will as well as a test of logistics. And so it's clear that Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people have superior will to Russian soldiers and Russian people. But it's also clear that Russia has more bodies than does Ukraine. So they are willing to continue to waste these lives. And I also am not able to figure out why the Russian population continues to act like sheep and allow so many men be sent to the slaughter without there being more and more domestic problems. But we also know that war is a test of logistics. And so going after Russia's logistics is how Ukraine, I think, breaks the back of Russian forces. To continue to attack transportation, to continue to attack ammunition storage, to continue to attack headquarters, which makes it impossible for Russia to use its one advantage, mass numbers. This is how I think we do this. And of course, the West has to continue with the sanctions because that affects Russia's logistics. And we also have to, the West has to decide that we are serious, that we want Ukraine to win. Let's deliver those capabilities. Let's deliver those capabilities now, not 6 months from now.
General, you were one of the most optimistic in the last several months. I mean, you made that prediction, I think, at the end of the summer, maybe early fall, that Ukraine will be able to get back Crimea, which actually Taras comes from. And recently we just heard about the secretive meeting in Washington with some Pentagon officials, which concluded that Ukraine will not be able to win back its territory going back to 1991 borders. I mean, do you still stand by your predictions?
Yeah, I do believe that Ukraine can liberate Crimea by the end of this summer, so the end of August, if, and that's a big if, the West provides the capabilities that are needed to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. Taras, you do know, I mean, the size of the peninsula, Ukraine knows where everything is, the air bases, the naval bases, the logistics sites. I mean, there's no place to hide. So what Ukraine needs is the ability to hit those targets that are well known and make it impossible for Russian Federation forces to stay there. Make sure that they can never repair Kerch Bridge. Continue to hit the land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol and Melitopol down into Crimea. And then hit Sevastopol, Saki, Zhankoy, and other sites with long-range precision weapons so that they cannot stay there. If we don't have those longer-range precision weapons in the next few months, then it will be very difficult for Ukraine to liberate Crimea by the end of this summer. Now, the meeting that you're talking about was reportedly a classified briefing by members of the Pentagon, senior people from the Pentagon, to members of the House Armed Services Committee, but it was a closed, classified briefing. So anything that was leaked out of there would be inappropriate. And I would also be skeptical of information that comes out of there, because people who leak information do so because they have their own agenda. They're trying to influence something. So that's why I'm not confident in what I read about what came out of that meeting. There is no doubt, however, that there are people in the Pentagon and in the White House that are skeptical. I mean, General Milley has said it publicly that Ukraine could eject Russia from Ukraine this year. He said it would be extremely difficult. And yes, it will be extremely difficult, and even more difficult if the Pentagon or if the administration does not provide those capabilities that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Going back to your comments on Crimea, we saw several military operations conducted on Crimean Peninsula during so-called Crimean War. Then United Kingdom, France, and Turkey attacked Russian Empire. Then we remember civil war in Russia 100 years ago, and effectively World War II. And of course, also the operations, military operations, were extremely difficult, first of all, because of landscape, very, very different. You wouldn't find a single piece on Ukrainian territory with that different kind of landscapes very close. And of course, we should also take into account high density of the population. Well, in Crimean Peninsula, well, in general, it's about 3.5 million population now. How do you think this military operation can be conducted by Ukrainian army not to harm civil population?
Well, again, this is part of the requirement is the long-range precision weapons, the capability to hit specific things such as the facilities at Sevastopol or the logistics base at Zhankoy or the air base at Saki and the other places, to make it where the Russians cannot use them anymore. So precision weapons, of course, reduces civilian casualties, unlike what the Russians are doing in their attacks on Ukrainian cities and the infrastructure. Now, I think that once people see that Ukraine is able to hit military targets in Crimea, I think you'll see people heading for the exit, wanting to leave, because Crimea will become a trap for Russians that are there.
General, I know I promised 15 minutes. Just one last question, very quickly, if you don't mind, on the political situation in Washington. We know Vladimir Putin is hoping to drag out this war long enough to where there's a different political wind in Washington, and we've heard from some politicians, you know who, that America needs to, wind down its aid to Ukraine. I mean, how significant is this? How much of a risk it is long term?
I think I feel confident that the Congress, in a bipartisan way, all this year will continue to support Ukraine. Excuse me. There's really only a small number of voices, and they're not senior people in the Congress on the Republican side that talk about stopping this. Yes, of course, you have people on Fox News, but I would not be. I'm not worried yet. And when Speaker McCarthy says, we need to no blank check, we need to pay close attention. Of course they do. That's their duty from the Constitution, is that the Congress provides oversight of spending. So that's them doing their duty. So that does not alarm me. And it didn't appear during the midterm elections that this was a big issue. I mean, there were not people running for Congress or Senate who made gains or lost because of they were pro or against support for Ukraine. I think most serious people realize that America's prosperity and America's security depends on Europe being secure and prosperous. And as long as Russia does what it's doing, Europe is never going to be secure and prosperous. And so it's in our interest to make sure that Russia is defeated. It's in our interest to make sure that the international rules-based order is protected, where respect for human rights, respect for sovereignty, respect for international law. This is important for us. And also, even for those people who are skeptical about, Ukraine, they said, no, we need to focus on China. Even they recognize, I think, that China is watching here, and that if Ukraine is not successful, if the West is not successful against China or against Russia, then I think China will not be too impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or the South China Sea. So these things are connected.
Question of credibility, indeed. Thank you, sir. Thank you, General. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Okay, best wishes to both of you and to your families for safety.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.